The flicker of the gas lamps in St. Louis barely illuminated the bruises beneath Isabella's veil. Tonight, she was to be Mrs. Sterling, a name that promised wealth, but sealed her fate to a man whose touch was poison. In the heart of the Gilded Age, while others dreamt of progress, Isabella dreamt only of escape. She wasn't seeking a new life, but simply the right to live at all. With her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, she fled west, trading a velvet prison for the brutal, unforgiving expanse of the Arizona desert. Little did she know her desperate flight would lead her not to death, but to him. St. Louis, 1888. The name Sterling echoed through the city's grand ballrooms and smoky gentlemen's clubs, with a reverence usually reserved for deities or railroad barons. Harrison Sterling, a man whose fortune was as vast as his reputation was spotless, was the city's most eligible widower. To the public, he was a pillar of society, a philanthropist whose name adorned orphanages and university halls. To Isabella, he was the architect of her own private hell. Her father, a once proud merchant named Thomas Cartwright, had fallen on hard times. A series of disastrous investments had left him teetering on the precipice of ruin. It was Sterling who had extended a hand, not out of charity, but with the cold, calculating precision of a predator. The price for her family's salvation was Isabella's hand in marriage. At 20, Isabella was a beauty, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes the hue of a summer sky. But her spirit, once as bright and untamed as a prairie fire, had been systematically smothered. The courtship was a meticulously crafted illusion. Publicly, Harrison Sterling was the epitome of charm, showering her with expensive gifts, diamonds that felt like tiny cold stones against her skin, and Parisian gowns that felt more like shrouds. He paraded her at opulent parties, his hand always possessively at the small of her back, a constant, chilling reminder of his ownership. The society pages of the Missouri Republican lauded them as the perfect couple, a union of wealth and beauty that seemed preordained. But behind the closed doors of the Sterling mansion on Lucas Place, the mask would slip. Harrison's affection was a twisted, suffocating thing. His moods were mercurial, shifting from cloying sweetness to terrifying rage in the span of a heartbeat. A misplaced book, a glance held a second too long at a servant, or a simple difference of opinion was enough to ignite his fury. His words were the first weapons, sharp and cruel, designed to strip her of her confidence and isolate her from anyone who might offer comfort. Her lady's maid, a kind older woman named Martha, saw the shadows under Isabella's eyes and the way she flinched at a raised voice. She tried to offer solace in quiet moments, her presence a small beacon in the encroaching darkness. But Sterling, with his uncanny ability to sense any allegiance not directed at him, dismissed Martha without cause, replacing her with a stern, watchful woman who reported Isabella's every move. The physical abuse began subtly, a grip on her arm that was too tight, leaving a constellation of faint bruises, a playful push that sent her stumbling. He was careful, always careful to leave no marks that couldn't be explained away as a clumsy accident. He was a master of manipulation, of gaslighting. After each incident, he would be awash with remorse, begging for forgiveness, swearing it would never happen again, blaming his passion, his overwhelming love for her. And Isabella, trapped by her father's debt and the societal impossibility of breaking an engagement to a man of Sterling's stature, had no choice but to accept. The wedding was planned for the first week of June. As the date loomed closer, the violence escalated. One evening he flew into a rage over the seating arrangements for the wedding dinner. He backhanded her the force of the blow, splitting her lip. As she tasted the salt of her own blood, a chilling clarity pierced through the fog of fear and helplessness. He wasn't just a cruel man. He was a monster, who would she now realized with sickening certainty eventually kill her. The wedding wouldn't be the beginning of a new life, but the end of hers. Escape. The word took root in her mind, a desperate, fragile seed in a barren landscape. But how Sterling watched her constantly. Her correspondence was monitored. Her every outing was chaperoned. St. Louis was his city. Every street corner, every friendly face was an extension of his power. She knew she couldn't simply run. She had to vanish. Her chance came in the form of a lie. She feigned a sentimental desire to visit her late mother's sister, an aunt she hadn't seen in years, who lived a quiet life in the bustling railroad town of Flagstaff, Arizona. It was a place Sterling considered beneath him a dusty outpost on the fringe of civilization. To her surprise, he agreed, perhaps seeing it as a final brief indulgence before she became his property entirely. He arranged her passage on the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway, booking her a private Pullman car and hiring a Pinkerton detective, a man named Miller, to ensure her safety. In the 2 weeks leading up to her departure, Isabella played the part of the devoted fiancée flawlessly. She smiled, she deferred, she endured his touch. But beneath the placid surface, a plan was taking shape. She secretly gathered what she could. A small, sharp paring knife from the kitchen, a sturdy pair of her brother's old trousers, and a simple cotton shirt bundled tightly and hidden at the bottom of her trunk. She stitched a small chamois pouch and filled it with the few pieces of her mother's jewelry that held real value, along with every dollar she could secret away. It wasn't much, but it was a start. On the day of her departure, Harrison Sterling stood on the platform at Union Station, a portrait of the doting fiancé. He kissed her, his lips cold against hers, and whispered a final, chilling promise. "I will be counting the moments until you are back in my arms, my dear. Do not be late." As the train steamed out of the station, pulling her away from the soot-stained skies of St. Louis, Isabella did not look back. She felt the watchful eyes of Miller, the Pinkerton from the end of the car. Her cage had changed shape from a mansion to a rail car, but she was still a prisoner. She knew then that her escape hadn't truly begun. It would have to happen out there in the vast, sun-scorched emptiness of the West, a land that promised either a new beginning or a swift, anonymous end. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels became the soundtrack to Isabella's frantic, silent planning. For 3 days, she was a model of quiet composure. She took her meals in her private car, read novels she couldn't comprehend, and stared out the window as the lush greenery of Missouri bled into the endless rolling plains of Kansas and the rugged red rock landscapes of New Mexico. The ever-present Mr. Miller, a stout man with a drooping mustache and eyes that missed nothing, was a constant shadow. He was polite, almost deferential, but his presence was as suffocating as Sterling's had been. Isabella knew that arriving in Flagstaff would be a death sentence. Sterling's influence, while strongest in St. Louis, had long tendrils. A telegram would be waiting. Her aunt, cowed by the power of the Sterling name, would ensure she was returned. No, her escape had to be messier, more definitive. She had to disappear in a place where no one would think to look for a society belle from St. Louis. Her geography was limited, gleaned from romanticized novels and railroad maps. She knew they were entering the Arizona Territory, a place described in hushed, fearful tones back east. A land of scorching deserts, hostile natives and outlaws. A land where a lone woman had little hope of survival. It was a terrifying prospect, but it was better than the certain damnation of returning to Harrison. Her moment came on the third night. The train was chugging through the vast empty expanse of the painted desert. Outside her window, the world was a canvas of surreal colors under a canopy of brilliant, indifferent stars. The air that drifted through the slightly open window was thin and cool, carrying the scent of dust and sage. Isabella had noted the train's routine. It would slow on the long, steep grades, the engine groaning under the strain. There was one such grade, about an hour after the last stop, a small, dusty watering hole that was little more than a telegraph office and a water tower. Miller, growing complacent after days of her docile behavior, had taken to drinking his supper in the dining car, often staying for a second or third whiskey. She dressed in the dark, her hands shaking so violently she could barely fasten the buttons on her brother's trousers. The rough denim felt alien against her skin, so different from the silk buttons and satins she was accustomed to. She pulled on a pair of sturdy walking boots she'd purchased under the guise of wanting to take country walks in Flagstaff. Over her simple shirt, she wore a dark, heavy coat. She tied her golden hair back and tucked it ruthlessly under a plain cap. In the dim reflection of the window, she was a stranger to herself. With her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, she slipped the small pouch of money and jewels into her pocket, along with the paring knife. She waited, listening to the sounds of the train. She heard the distant, hearty laugh of Miller from the dining car. It was now or never. Moving silently, she slipped out of her compartment. The Pullman car was quiet, its occupants asleep. She moved through the narrow corridor. Her steps light, her breath held tight in her chest. She passed the sleeping porter, his head slumped on his chest. At the end of the car was a small platform, a space between the cars used for loading luggage. The night air hit her with a bracing shock. The train was moving faster than she had anticipated, the ground a blur of rock and shadow below. For a terrifying moment, her resolve faltered. The sheer insane recklessness of what she was about to do washed over her. She thought of Harrison's face, his cold eyes, the sting of his hand on her cheek. The memory was a spur, driving her forward. She climbed over the safety chain, her back pressed against the cold steel of the car. The wind whipped at her, trying to tear her from her precarious perch. She looked down at the dark, rushing ground. This was a leap not just from a train, but from her entire life into an abyss of utter uncertainty. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she closed her eyes and jumped. The impact was brutal. She had tried to aim for a sandy patch she'd glimpsed, but in the dark it was impossible. She landed on her side, a jarring shock that radiated through every bone in her body. The air was knocked from her lungs in a painful gasp, and she tumbled head over heels down a short, rocky embankment, the coarse gravel tearing at her clothes and skin. She came to a stop in a tangle of thorny bushes, her body screaming in protest. For a long moment she lay there, stunned, listening to the sound of the train recede into the distance. Its whistle, a mournful cry that seemed to mock her. Then silence. A profound, absolute silence, unlike anything she had ever known. The silence of the desert. Pain slowly began to register. Her ankle throbbed with a searing heat. Her sweat was a canvas of agony. Her hands were raw and bleeding. Pushing herself up, a wave of dizziness washed over her. She fought it back, adrenaline and fear, a potent cocktail in her veins. She was alive. She was free. And she was utterly terrifyingly alone in the middle of the vast, uncaring wilderness of the Arizona Territory. The moon, a cold silver disk in the inky sky, offered the only light illuminating a landscape of stark alien beauty and unimaginable peril. The desert at night was a world transformed. The oppressive heat of the day had bled away, replaced by a surprising, penetrating chill. Isabella, shivering from a combination of cold shock and fear, stumbled away from the railroad tracks, driven by a primal instinct to put as much distance as possible between herself and the path of her pursuers. She knew Miller would raise the alarm as soon as he discovered her gone. They would stop the train, backtrack, and search. Her only hope was to become a ghost. Her ankle was a fiery torment, each step a fresh wave of agony. She had twisted it badly in the fall. Gritting her teeth, she tore a strip of fabric from the hem of her shirt and bound it tightly the makeshift brace, offering little more than a sliver of support. She had no water, no food, and no idea where she was going. Her only guide was the North Star, a point of celestial certainty in a world that had dissolved into chaos. She moved south away from the railroad line, deeper into the heart of the desert. The landscape was treacherous. Jagged rocks, thorny cacti that seemed to reach for her in the dark, and unseen gullies pocked the terrain. She fell several times each fall, reopening her wounds and sending fresh jolts of pain through her exhausted body. The fine, expensive boots she wore, meant for city strolls, were no match for the brutal ground. As dawn approached, the eastern sky began to glow with a soft, pearlescent light, outlining the mesas and buttes in shades of purple and grey. The rising sun brought with it the first hint of the day's coming heat and a new kind of terror. The desert, which had been a place of shadows and unseen threats, was now revealed in its vast, desolate glory. It stretched in every direction, an endless sea of sand, rock, and scrub, offering no sign of water shelter or life. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. Her throat was a desert in itself, parched and raw. Her head pounded from dehydration. The adrenaline that had fueled her through the night was gone, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and a growing sense of despair. She sank to the ground, the rough sand a welcome if temporary respite. Tears of frustration and fear carved clean tracks through the grime on her face. Had she escaped Harrison's cage only to die in this God-forsaken wasteland? It was then that she saw him. At first he was just a shape, a smudge of darkness against the ochre rock of a small canyon wall perhaps 50 yards away. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. An outlaw, a prospector. The stories of the Apache. The fierce, ghost-like warriors of this land flooded her mind. She had been raised on tales of their savagery, of settlers tortured and killed. She remained perfectly still, trying to make herself small, to blend into the landscape. But the figure was not moving. As the sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows, she could make out more details. It was a man slumped against the rock. He was bare-chested, his skin the color of burnished copper, his long black hair unbound and matted with dirt and something dark. Blood. He was an Apache, and he was wounded. Badly. A war of instincts raged within her. Every story, every prejudice, screamed at her to run, to hide, to get as far away as possible. He was the enemy, the savage she had been taught to fear her entire life. But her flight from Harrison, her leap into the unknown, had shaken her world to its foundations. She had been the victim of a savage who wore fine suits and quoted poetry. What did she really know of savagery? She watched him for what felt like an eternity. He didn't move. Was he dead? Curiosity, or perhaps a flicker of the compassion that Sterling had tried so hard to extinguish, began to outweigh her fear. Cautiously wincing with every step on her injured ankle, she began to move toward him. As she drew closer, the extent of his injuries became horrifyingly clear. A deep, ragged gash ran across his ribs, caked with dried blood and dirt. It looked like a gunshot wound, old and festering. His breathing was shallow, his lips cracked and pale. His face, etched with lines of pain, even in unconsciousness, was proud and angular, with a strong jaw and high cheekbones. He was young, perhaps not much older than she was. Beside him lay a single eagle feather and a beautifully crafted but empty leather water skin. She stood over him, her shadow falling across his face. His eyes flickered open. They were as black as obsidian, and for a moment they held a flicker of fierce, untamed pride. Then they clouded with pain and exhaustion. He saw her a white woman dressed in the strange clothes of a man, and a low groan, a sound of pure misery, escaped his lips. He tried to push himself up, his hand instinctively going to his side where a knife would normally be, but the effort was too much. He collapsed back against the rock, his eyes closing once more. Isabella's fear was replaced by a sudden, overwhelming sense of shared humanity. Here in the heart of the desert, they were not a white woman and an Apache warrior. They were two wounded souls, both at the mercy of the unforgiving land. Her own thirst was a raging fire in her throat, her pain a constant thrum. But his need was clearly greater. He was dying. Making a decision that defied all logic and every warning she had ever received, she knelt beside him. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice a raw croak. "I'm not going to hurt you." He did not respond. His stillness was terrifying. She looked around desperately. There had to be water somewhere. The canyon walls suggested that water might flow here during the rare rains. She scanned the ground, her eyes searching for any sign of green, any hint of moisture. A few yards away, tucked into a crevice at the base of the canyon wall, she saw it, a small shaded pool of water, murky and still, but undeniably water. It was a miracle. She limped to the pool, cupping her hands and drinking the cool, life-giving liquid. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drank until her stomach ached, then turned back to the wounded man. How to get the water to him? Remembering the paring knife in her pocket, she pulled it out. She found a broad, succulent leaf on a nearby cactus, and carefully trying to avoid the spines, she sawed it off at the base. It was clumsy work, but she managed to create a makeshift bowl. She filled it with water and hobbled back to the Apache warrior. She knelt beside him again, lifting his head gently. His skin was feverishly hot. "Please," she said, her voice soft. "You must drink." She brought the cactus leaf to his cracked lips. At first he didn't respond. Then, as if sensing the water, his lips parted slightly. She tilted the leaf, letting a small trickle of water flow into his mouth. He swallowed, a faint convulsive movement in his throat. He drank weakly at first, then more eagerly, the primal need for water overriding his suspicion and pain. When he had taken all the water the leaf could hold, he sagged back against her arm, his eyes still closed. Isabella didn't know if she was saving his life or merely prolonging his suffering. She didn't know if he would thank her or kill her if he regained his strength. All she knew was that in the vast, silent theater of the desert, she had chosen compassion over fear. And for the first time since leaving St. Louis, she felt a glimmer not of hope, but of purpose. The sun climbed to its zenith, beating down on the canyon with a merciless, white-hot intensity. The shade from the rock wall where they sheltered shrank, forcing Isabella to huddle closer to the wounded Apache. The heat was a physical presence, shimmering off the rocks and baking the very air she breathed. She made several more trips to the small pool, bringing water for both of them. Each time she returned, she found the warrior in the same position, his breathing still shallow, his body radiating a dangerous heat. The gunshot wound on his side was inflamed, the edges an angry red. It was clear that without proper care, the infection would kill him long before thirst or starvation could. Isabella's mind raced. Her knowledge of medicine was limited to what a young society woman was taught how to treat a minor burn or a case of the vapors. Nothing had prepared her for this. She thought of Martha, her former maid, who had always known which herbs to brew for a fever, which poultices to apply to a cut. But Martha was a world away. Here there was only her own uncertain intellect and the meager contents of her pockets. She knew the wound had to be cleaned. Rummaging in her coat, her fingers closed around a small silver flask she had completely forgotten. It had been a gift from her brother James, filled with brandy, for the unforeseen rigors of travel. It was a silly, extravagant gift, but now it might be a lifesaver. She knelt beside the man again. "I have to clean this," she said, more to herself than to him. "It's going to hurt. I'm sorry." He remained unconscious, or at least unresponsive. With a deep breath to steady her nerves, she uncapped the flask. The sharp scent of brandy cut through the dusty air. She tore another strip from her now tattered shirt, soaked it with the fiery liquid, and gently, hesitantly, began to clean the edges of the wound. The moment the alcohol touched his raw flesh, his body arched in a silent scream of agony. His eyes flew open, black and blazing with a mixture of pain and pure, undiluted fury. A guttural cry was torn from his throat, and with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength that seemed impossible, he lunged at her. His hand closed around her wrist, his grip like a band of iron. He was weak, but the ferocity of the attack caught her completely by surprise, sending them both tumbling in the sand. He was on top of her, his face inches from hers, his teeth bared in a snarl. She could feel the fever heat pouring off him, could see the disorientation and rage in his eyes. He was a cornered animal, lashing out at the source of his pain. Terror, stark and absolute, seized her. This was it. This was the savagery she had been warned about. Her compassion had been a fool's errand. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. But it didn't come. His grip on her wrist, while immensely strong, did not tighten further. His ragged breaths were hot against her cheek. She dared to open her eyes. He was staring at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He saw not a threat, but the genuine fear in her own eyes. He saw the discarded alcohol-soaked rag. He saw the open flask. His expression shifted. The raw fury receded, replaced by a flicker of something else. Confusion, perhaps even a dawning awareness. His grip loosened slightly. I was trying to help," Isabella stammered, her voice trembling. "The wound, it's infected. The spirits, they clean it." He did not seem to understand her words, but he understood the intent. He looked from her face to the wound on his side, and then back to her. The fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by the dull glaze of pain and exhaustion. The last of his strength seemed to desert him. His body went slack, and he collapsed onto her, his full weight pressing her into the sand. For a long moment she lay pinned beneath him, his hot cheek against hers, listening to the labored rasp of his breathing. He was no longer a threat, just a desperately ill man. Carefully she wriggled out from under him, her heart still hammering against her ribs. He lay still, his eyes closed once more. She had made a terrible miscalculation, nearly getting herself killed. And yet something had changed between them. He had seen her, truly seen her, and had chosen not to harm her. A fragile, unspoken truce had been forged in that moment of violent confrontation. Her resolve hardened. She would not be deterred. She tore a fresh piece of cloth and, bracing herself, went back to her task. This time she spoke to him as she worked her voice low and steady, hoping the sound, if not the words, would be soothing. "My name is Isabella," she said, softly, dabbing at the angry flesh. "I'm not from here. I'm running. Just like you, I suppose." He flinched as she cleaned deeper, but he did not lash out again. A low groan was his only response. "I don't know your name. I don't know anything about you, but I'm not going to leave you here to die." When the wound was as clean as she could get it, she used the last of the clean cloth from her shirt to create a makeshift bandage, tying it securely around his torso. His fever was still dangerously high. She knew she had to try and bring it down. She spent the rest of the afternoon making trip after trip to the pool, soaking strips of her coat and laying the cool, wet fabric on his forehead and chest. It was a slow, exhausting process. The sun began its descent, painting the western sky in fiery strokes of orange and crimson. The desert heat began to recede, and the chill of the coming night started to creep back into the air. As twilight settled over the canyon, the Apache warrior stirred again. This time, there was no violence. His eyes opened, and they were clearer than before. The haze of delirium had lifted, though the pain was still deeply etched on his features. He looked at her, then at the bandage on his side. His gaze shifted to the empty flask and the tattered remnants of her shirt. His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw not a savage, but a man. A flicker of gratitude, faint but unmistakable, shone in their dark depths. He raised a hand, his fingers brushing against the wet cloth on his forehead. Then his lips moved, and he spoke a single word, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "Nakai." He had given her his name. Days bled into one another, each marked by the slow, arduous passage of the sun across the vast, empty sky. The canyon became their world, a sanctuary and a prison. The fragile truce between Isabella and Nakai solidified into a strange, silent partnership born of mutual necessity and a slowly dawning respect. Communication was a significant barrier, a chasm between their two worlds. They spoke in gestures, in fragments. Isabella would point to herself and say, "Isabella." He would nod, his gaze steady, and repeat his own name, Nakai, his voice growing stronger each day. He taught her the Apache word for water, tu, a word she came to cherish. She in turn pointed to the sun and said its name, and he would give her his word for it, ji. Their shared vocabulary grew slowly, word by precious word. Isabella's medical knowledge may have been scant, but her diligence was unwavering. She kept Nakai's wound clean, changing the dressing daily, with strips torn from what was left of her coat. She kept him hydrated, patiently, bringing him water in the clumsy cactus leaf bowl. Slowly, miraculously, the fever broke. The angry redness around the wound began to subside, and the signs of healing began to appear. As his strength returned, Nakai began to contribute to their survival in ways that humbled her. He showed her which roots were edible, digging them from the hard, packed earth with a sharpened rock. He pointed out a type of cactus whose fruit, once the vicious spines were carefully removed, was fleshy and surprisingly sweet. He taught her how to read the land, to see the subtle signs of life she had previously missed, the track of a lizard in the sand, the distant circling of a hawk that might indicate a water source. One afternoon, he motioned for her to follow him. Limping heavily, he led her to a part of the canyon she hadn't explored. There, etched into the smooth red rock of the canyon wall, were drawings. Stylized figures of men on horseback, of deer, of suns and spirals. They were ancient, weathered by time, but their power was undeniable. Nakai touched the drawing of a warrior with a feathered lance, then touched his own chest. He pointed to the sky, then swept his arm across the vast landscape. He was telling her his story, the story of his people in a language older than words. Isabella stood in awe, realizing that the empty desert she had feared was in fact a living history book, filled with stories and meaning. She was only just beginning to comprehend. The fear she had carried for so long began to recede, replaced by a quiet competence. She learned to move carefully on her still sore ankle, to conserve her energy during the brutal heat of the day, and to listen to the subtle language of the desert. The grime on her face and the calluses on her hands were a testament to her transformation. The fragile society belle from St. Louis was gone, burned away by the desert sun. In her place was a survivor. But their fragile peace was shadowed by the constant unspoken threat of discovery. Isabella often found herself staring north towards the unseen railroad tracks, her stomach twisting into a knot. Harrison Sterling was not a man to accept defeat. He would have men searching for her. Miller the Pinkerton would be relentless. The thought of his face, of his cold, possessive touch, was enough to send a chill down her spine, even in the midday heat. One evening, as they sat by a small, smokeless fire, Nakai had taught her how to build in a shallow pit. He noticed the haunted look in her eyes. He had been carving a piece of wood with a sharp flint, his hands surprisingly deft. He stopped his gaze, questioning. Isabella struggled to explain. "Man," she said, pointing north. "My husband." The word felt like ash in her mouth. She made a gesture of a fist of cruelty. "He hurts me." She touched her own cheek, remembering the sting of Harrison's hand. "He will look for me. Men with guns." Nakai's expression hardened. He understood. He had seen the fear in her before, but now he understood its source. He pointed to the gunshot wound on his side. Then he pointed to the east. He spoke a name, his voice low and filled with a cold anger. John Mackay. The name meant nothing to Isabella, but the hatred in Nakai's tone was unmistakable. He then used a combination of gestures and the few words they shared to tell his own story. Mackay was a rancher, a white man, whose cattle were encroaching on Apache lands. There had been a skirmish. Nakai's small band of warriors had been ambushed. He had been shot and left for dead, separated from his people. Just as she was running from a man who sought to possess her, he was running from men who sought to eradicate him. Their enemies were different, but their struggle was the same. The revelation was a profound moment of connection. They were not just two survivors. They were allies, bound by the shared experience of being hunted. That night, the silence between them was different. It was no longer a void of misunderstanding, but a comfortable space of shared knowledge and empathy. A few days later, Nakai was strong enough to walk without a severe limp. He knew they could not stay in the canyon forever. Their meager food sources were dwindling, and the risk of discovery grew with each passing day. He motioned for her to pack their few belongings: the flask, the paring knife, the water skin he had repaired with a resinous gum from a desert plant. As she prepared to leave, Isabella's gaze fell on the pouch containing her mother's jewelry. It felt like a relic from another life, another person. The diamonds and gold were worthless here. She thought of Harrison of the world, where such trinkets determined a person's value. Without hesitation, she walked to a deep crevice in the rock and dropped the pouch in. It landed with a soft, final thud. It was a shedding of her old skin, a final definitive break with the gilded cage she had fled. Nakai watched her, his expression unreadable. He offered her a small piece of dried cactus fruit. She took it, their fingers brushing. It was a simple gesture, but it held a world of meaning. They were ready. He pointed south towards a distant range of purple mountains that shimmered in the heat haze. It was a daunting, perilous journey. But as Isabella looked from the mountains to the steady, resilient man beside her, she did not feel fear. For the first time in her life, she felt a profound and liberating sense of hope. Together, they turned their backs on the canyon and walked out into the vast, uncertain promise of the desert. The journey south was a trial by fire. The landscape shifted from the rocky confines of the canyon to vast, open plains of sand and scrub, offering little shade and even less water. The sun was a relentless tyrant, and the days became a grueling routine of walking in the cooler hours of the morning and evening and seeking shelter from the midday heat under sparse, thorny acacia trees or the meager shade of a rock outcropping. Isabella learned the true meaning of endurance. Her body, once accustomed to the soft comforts of city life, hardened. Her skin tanned. Her muscles grew wiry and strong. She learned to ignore the constant ache in her feet and the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. Nakai was a patient teacher and a silent, watchful guardian. He taught her to find water by following the flight of bees, to set simple snares for rabbits and other small game, and to build a small, efficient shelter from branches and brush. He also taught her to fight. One evening he handed her a smooth, heavy stone. Through gestures he showed her how to hold it, how to put the weight of her body behind a throw. He would set up targets: a prominent cactus, a discolored rock, and have her practice for hours. At first her throws were clumsy and weak, but she persisted, driven by the memory of her own helplessness. She would never be a warrior like him, but she would never again be a defenseless victim. As they traveled, the bond between them deepened, transcending the need for a shared language. They communicated through a look, a gesture, the quiet comfort of a shared silence. In the evenings, by the dim light of their small fire, he would sometimes speak, his voice a low murmur. She didn't understand the Apache words, but she understood the cadence, the stories of his people, of their gods, of their connection to the land they now traveled. And in return she would speak of her own life, of the cold grey streets of St. Louis, of her brother James, of her love for books and music. He would listen intently, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight, seeming to understand the emotion, if not the details. One night, under a sky so thick with stars, it looked like spilled diamonds. He reached out and gently touched a long, faded scar on her forearm, a relic from a fall from a pony in her childhood. She had told him the story once, a simple, happy memory from a life he could barely imagine. He then showed her a small, circular scar on his own shoulder, and through a series of dramatic gestures, told her of his first successful hunt as a boy, of the pride in his father's eyes. In that moment, sharing the stories of their scars, they were not white and Apache man and woman, but simply two people who had found solace in each other's presence. But the ghost of Isabella's past was not far behind. One afternoon, as they crested a low mesa, Nakai suddenly dropped to the ground, pulling her down with him. He pointed to the north. In the far distance, shimmering in the heat, were two riders, tiny specks of black against the vast expanse of yellow-brown earth. "Miller." Isabella breathed, her blood running cold. She didn't know how she knew, but she was certain. Harrison would not have given up. He would have hired the best. Nakai's face was grim. He had seen them, too. They were still miles away, but they were following the general direction of their travel. They were being tracked. Fear, the old familiar companion she thought she had conquered, returned with a vengeance. Her hands trembled, and her breath came in short, sharp gasps. Nakai placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. His touch was firm, reassuring. He looked into her eyes, his own gaze clear and resolute. There was no fear in him, only a quiet, deadly seriousness. He led them away from the open plain into a labyrinth of broken rocky hills. It was harder terrain, but it offered more cover. For 2 days they played a deadly game of cat and mouse. They traveled through narrow ravines, their footsteps muffled by the soft sand. They scaled rock faces that left Isabella's hands raw and bleeding. They rested in short, frantic bursts, always listening, always watching. On the 3rd day, the trackers grew closer. They could hear the dislodged pebbles from the horses' hooves, the faint murmur of voices carried on the wind. They were trapped in a box canyon, a dead end with sheer rock walls on 3 sides. There was nowhere left to run. Panic seized Isabella. "It's over," she whispered, her back pressed against the cold rock. "They've found me." Nakai shook his head. He pointed to a narrow ledge halfway up the canyon wall. It was a perilous climb, but it led to a small, dark opening, a cave. He pressed the smooth throwing stone into her hand. His message was clear. She was to climb, to hide, and to wait. He would face them. "No," Isabella protested, grabbing his arm. "Nakai, no. There are 2 of them. They have rifles." He gently removed her hand. He touched the healing wound on his side, then pointed at her. He made a gesture of a debt being paid. He was protecting her, just as she had protected him. He then gave her a look of such profound tenderness that it stole her breath away. It was a look that spoke of a future they might have had in another world, another time. Before she could argue further, he pressed his flint and steel into her other hand, along with a small bundle of dry tinder and a piece of pitch pine he always carried. He pointed to the cave, then made a gesture of smoke, of fire. He had a plan. Trusting him, her heart breaking with fear for his safety, Isabella began the treacherous climb. The rock was loose, and she nearly fell twice. Finally, gasping for breath, she pulled herself onto the ledge and scrambled into the dark, cool mouth of the cave. Below, Nakai moved to the center of the canyon floor. He did not hide. He stood tall and straight, a lone, defiant figure against the red rock. He was armed only with his knife and a primitive bow he had crafted during their travels with a handful of arrows fletched with hawk feathers. Minutes later, the 2 riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon. The man in the lead was stout with a drooping mustache. It was Miller. The man beside him was lean and wiry, with the cold, dead eyes of a hired gun. They reined in their horses, their rifles held at the ready. "Well, well," Miller called out, his voice echoing in the enclosed space. "Look what we have here. A redskin. Where is she, boy? Where's the girl?" Nakai stood silent, his face a mask of stone. "He don't look like he's in a talking mood, Miller," the other man drawled, raising his rifle. "Hold on, Frank," Miller said. "Sterling wants her back alive. Let's not be hasty." He dismounted, his eyes scanning the canyon. "She's got to be here somewhere. She couldn't have survived this long out here alone. He's been helping her." Miller took a step forward. "We can do this easy, or we can do this hard. Your choice." From her vantage point in the cave, Isabella watched in terror. She saw Nakai draw his bow, a silent, deadly promise. Her mind raced. What was his plan? The flint, the tinder. Then she understood. At the back of the small cave was a large pile of dried brush and what looked like old animal nests, the debris of years. With trembling hands, she struck the flint against the steel. A tiny spark flew, catching on the tinder. She blew on it gently, nurturing the fragile ember into a tiny flame. Then she thrust the flame into the heart of the dry brush pile. The brush dryer's bone caught fire with a sudden explosive whoosh. A thick, acrid column of smoke billowed out from the mouth of the cave, pouring down the canyon wall like a foul waterfall. Down below, the sudden eruption of smoke startled the two men and their horses. The animals whinnied and reared in panic, their eyes rolling. "What in tarnation?" Frank yelled, fighting to control his spooked mount. The smoke was Nakai's signal. In that moment of confusion, he moved. He was not a man. He was a phantom, a blur of motion. Before Miller or Frank could react, an arrow hissed through the air, burying itself deep in Frank's shoulder. The man cried out, dropping his rifle as he clutched at the shaft protruding from his flesh. Nakai didn't wait for a second shot. He sprinted towards Miller, who was fumbling to raise his own rifle. His attention divided between the Apache warrior and the chaos of the smoke and the panicked horses. Nakai closed the distance with terrifying speed, his knife flashing in the sun. He didn't aim to kill. He sliced the leather straps of Miller's saddlebags, sending a cascade of supplies, canteens, food, ammunition, tumbling to the ground. He slapped the rump of Miller's horse with the flat of his blade, sending the terrified animal galloping out of the canyon. Frank's horse, now riderless, as Frank had fallen to the ground, writhing in pain, followed suit. The two trackers were now afoot. One wounded their supplies, scattered in the middle of a hostile desert. Nakai stood before them, his bow ready. Another arrow knocked. He was in complete control. Miller stared, his face a mixture of disbelief and fear. He looked from the implacable warrior to the smoke still pouring from the cave, and a flicker of understanding dawned in his eyes. He had underestimated them both. From the cave, Isabella watched, her heart in her throat. She had done her part. Now it was in Nakai's hands. Nakai gave Miller a cold, hard look. He pointed to the wounded Frank, then pointed out of the canyon. The message was clear. Take him and go. Never return. Miller, his bravado completely gone, nodded quickly. He helped the groaning Frank to his feet, and supporting him, they stumbled out of the canyon, leaving their scattered supplies and their rifles behind. They knew they were beaten. To be left alive was a mercy they had not expected and would not test. When they were gone, Nakai stood for a long moment, watching the entrance to the canyon, ensuring they would not return. Then he looked up at the cave. Isabella, covered in soot, her face streaked with tears of relief, began the clumsy climb down. When she reached the bottom, she ran to him, throwing her arms around him in a gesture that needed no translation. He was stiff at first, surprised by the contact. Then his arm slowly came around her, holding her tightly. They stood there for a long moment in the smoky silence of the canyon, two survivors who had stared into the abyss and saved each other. They gathered what was useful from the scattered supplies, 2 full canteens, a bag of dried jerky, and most importantly, the rifles and a pouch of ammunition. The weapons shifted the balance of power. They were no longer just survivors. They were formidable. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon, Nakai pointed once more to the south, to the distant purple mountains. His expression was no longer just about survival. It was about a destination, a home. Their journey continued, but it was different now. A quiet confidence had settled between them. They were a team forged in adversity, bound by a trust deeper than words. They traveled for another week, the mountains growing larger and greener, until one evening they arrived at a hidden valley, a place of impossible beauty with a clear stream, tall pines, and lush grass. In this valley was a small, sheltered encampment. A handful of Apache families, women, children, and old men emerged cautiously. They were the remnants of Nakai's people, the ones who had survived the attack by Makai's men. Their faces were worn with hardship, but their eyes lit up with joy and disbelief at the sight of Nakai. He was a son, a brother, a leader returned from the dead. He spoke to them, into their flowing tongue, his voice filled with emotion. He told them of the ambush, of his wound of the desert. And then he turned to Isabella, and his gaze softened. He spoke her name, and though she could not understand his words, she saw the respect and gratitude in the eyes of his people as they looked at her. They saw not a white woman, an enemy, but the person who had saved one of their own. Isabella had escaped one life only to find another she could never have imagined. She had traded the gilded cage of St. Louis for the vast, open freedom of the Arizona territory. She had fled a man who saw her as a possession and found a man who saw her as an equal. Life in the valley was hard, but it was honest. She learned the rhythms of the seasons, the language of the Apache, the skills of a life lived in harmony with the land. The memory of Harrison Sterling and the world he represented faded like a bad dream. Here her worth was not measured in jewels or social standing, but in her resilience, her compassion, her courage. She never knew if Miller and Frank made it back, or what story they told. She never knew if Harrison ever stopped looking for her. She did not care. Her past was a ghost, and her future was here in this hidden valley beside Nakai. Their love story was not one of poems and whispered promises in a grand ballroom, but one of shared hardship, silent understanding, and a bond forged in the crucible of the desert. It was a story written not in ink, but in the red dust of the earth, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to find freedom and love in the most unlikely of places. Isabella's journey from a gilded cage to the heart of the Apache nation is a testament to the strength that lies dormant within us all. It's a story about breaking free, not just from physical chains, but from the invisible prisons of expectation and fear. She and Nakai, two people from warring worlds, found common ground in their shared struggle for survival, proving that empathy and courage can bridge any divide. Theirs is a reminder that sometimes the most profound love stories aren't written in ballrooms, but are carved into the harsh, beautiful landscape of a life reclaimed. If their story of courage, survival, and unexpected love moved you, please take a moment to hit the like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates a tale of true resilience, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas from the annals of history. Your support allows us to continue bringing these incredible stories to light. Thank you for listening.